Thank you very much. Thank you to the forum, to the organizers, to Gonzalo and others for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. So I've spent the last 25 years, and especially over the last 15, working with communities to fix failing public projects and services. Projects undermined by fraud, corruption, and mismanagement. I gave a talk a couple of years ago at a conference on corruption in the humanitarian sector in Geneva. And in the coffee break afterwards, the senior auditor of one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations, he was actually Spanish, and he had worked in the private sector before, he said, you know, you gave an interesting talk. Let me share with you the reality of my workplace. We set up a new accounting system. It costs a lot of money. We set up a new accounting system over the last couple of years. And if you want to know how much money we spent on building toilets, I am now in a position to tell you that within a couple of days. It was impossible before, but now I can tell you how much money we spent. If you want to know how many toilets we built, it'll be a bit tougher, but I can produce a report that says that. But if you want to know how many toilets we actually built, I have no idea, and no one in the organization knows. If we were a private company, we wouldn't be allowed to exist. Imagine the finance director of the Hilton chain saying, yeah, we spent 200 million to build new hotels last year, but we have no idea where they are, and we have no idea how many hotels there are. But that's the reality of one of the largest humanitarian organizations today. One of the biggest development NGOs has built several 100,000 latrines over the last 40 years. A couple of years ago, they went back to check how many latrines were still working 2 years later. 5% were working 2 years later. So what I want to share with you is that we have actually been rewarding organizations for decades for an input model, which is how much money they raise and spent, to an output model, which is how much they say they have done and the activities they have conducted. But we really need to be moving towards an outcome model, which is what actually happens on the ground, and even an impact model, which would capture the positive externalities generated from activities. And we're far from that today. The biggest project in the world today, program, to deal with sanitation is the one in India. It's one of the flagship programs of Prime Minister Modi, Swachh Bharat. And I was just looking on the website of Swachh Bharat this morning to see how many toilets they have built, and it's just over 4 million latrines in homes and over 5 million public latrines that they say have been built. And they report that 3,357 cities in the country that has the highest rate, large country, with the highest rate of open defecation in the world, with all the problems that entails. So they say that 3,357 cities are now open defecation free. Unfortunately, these are again are output metrics of the most superficial kind. These are output metrics generated by civil servants who have all the pressure in the world to report that they're delivering. There's no validation of these outcome metrics, output metrics, at the moment at all. And the fear is that it's not that different, maybe it's marginally better than the case of that development NGO that had 5% toilets still working after 2 years. But these are catastrophic failures. They have nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with money. They don't really have to do with incentives in the big picture. It has everything to do with us failing to capture one extraordinarily impactful and powerful thing which is missing from the equation of governance, which is bottom-up accountability. Which is accountability from the users, the beneficiaries, and communities. And that's simply not built into the system. So what I want to propose to you is that that's the biggest missed opportunity in the governance, in the effectiveness of delivery in water and sanitation. and that it has components that make it an integral part of any financing mechanism. Any serious financing mechanism, of course, moves the needle to an outcome model. And that if you want to generate relevant and trustworthy, we spoke about trust in the earlier sections, trustworthy outcome data, it cannot be done top-down alone. Top-down has a role, but it has to be complemented by a real bottom-up. So what can that look like on the ground? So let me take you to Kwale County on the Indian Ocean coast of Kenya, on the border with Tanzania, one of the poorest counties in Kenya. Kwale has Diani Beach. Diani Beach is a gorgeous beach. It's regularly rated the most beautiful beach in Africa. So there are a number of hotels along that. But if you just step down 2 kilometers from the tourist track, you're in a very poor county indeed. We were working there a few years ago, in 2012, and the most basic problem people had in the villages was no access to clean drinking water. Forget about sanitation, no access to clean drinking water. And this despite government after government and budget cycle after budget cycle promising that this year they would get access to clean drinking water. Now, the methodology that it took me 10 years to develop is about how communities can hold the implementers and budget holders properly to account. And so in the next budget cycle, what they did was to monitor that process throughout. And at the time, our success rate was a bit over a third. So a third of villages that had never had, many of them, clean drinking water ever, were then able to get access to clean drinking water. This was all driven by people in the community. We ran out of money to work there, and then the NGO we supported collapsed, which wasn't very good. 2 years later, I went back to see what had happened. All the communities that had been able to get their clean drinking water, all of them still had functioning pumps. In fact, they had done one better. They had used the same approach to ask for more, and they got better services. And so the monitoring was still going on despite a lack of support. So I've done this now over 3,000 times for over $1 billion of public projects, hundreds of them being water projects. And now with a success rate of over 55% on average. So over half the problems that are identified are resolved through this mechanism. And what it does is to actually build trust. It's identifying problems, but by problem solving collectively, what it's actually doing is building trust. Now, what you have to do in order to enable that is to let go of some power. It means that people in the community are able to identify problems, but above all are being trained to be problem solvers. So we've done this for earthquake reconstruction in Nepal, for example, where after year 2, only 5% of 800,000 homes that needed rebuilding had been rebuilt, despite the money sitting in bank accounts. There was money in bank accounts and only 5% completion. We worked with the communities to monitor. They found 1,300 problems in 700 homes and were able to resolve 2/3 of those problems. I don't need to convince you, I guess, that that's a great completion rate when only 5% of the homes had been completed at that point. Now, there are a couple of shortcuts that people have taken to community participation. So one of them, there are 3 main shortcuts that people have taken. One is to rely simply on satisfaction, on general feedback. And that's a very weak indicator on its own. Because if people don't know what they're supposed to get, for example, were they supposed to get taps in each home, or is it one water pump in the village? Their satisfaction is not a good indicator. The second thing that people have done is to crowdsource problem reporting. If crowdsourcing problem reporting, which can very easily be done, of course, today, with the ubiquity of feature phones and mobile phones, if that worked, that would be brilliant, it would be very easy. The problem is it doesn't work. So, for example, an effort in Uganda and Tanzania crowdsourced reporting of failed water pumps. They had 20,000 reports of failed water pumps, but it didn't lead to almost any of them being repaired afterwards. And the third shortcut that people take is to rely on technologies of detection, of self-reporting, that technologies on their own will provide the diagnosis. Again, that can be very powerful, but on its own, at the moment, it's not a scalable, viable, and sustainable proposition. Certainly not for the bottom 4 billion. It will work, of course, for sophisticated mechanisms in a rich country, but it will not be relevant for the bottom 4 billion. Just one small example is when Narendra Modi introduced, for example, fingerprint scanners in public schools in India. What the teachers did was to destroy all of them. So there were no fingerprint scanners to sign in and sign out. But these three components are powerful, of course, when combined with the skill of problem solving. So what it took me 10 years to learn is to crowdsource problem solving, not simply problem reporting, and capturing the rate at which people are able to solve problems. And I've called that the fixed rate, or you can call it the resolution rate. What you want to incentivize is people's capacity to make things actually better. And this is what we're building in to the model that Arthur has created. It's really building in the capacity to problem solve, to measure that metric of the outcome is simply a byproduct of people taking ownership of the outcome themselves. And what you will capture through that as well are all the positive externalities generated through that process. So I'll leave you with the last word, which is that enormous challenge of moving organizations which have been rewarded for decades simply on inputs. How much money do they raise? Then it's been outputs. What do they say they have done? And now we really need to be moving towards outcomes and impact. And the only way to do that seriously is to combine top-down with a very strong ownership from below. And what it took me 10 years to learn is the way you achieve that is when people are able to problem solve, when they're actually able to identify what's not working, but then to learn how to solve those problems as well. Thank you.
Thank you.